afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of The Democratic View. I'm the hostess. My name is Phyllis Italiano, and with me today I have two people who are going to talk a little bit with us about writing and that process, which is very complicated. We'll probably talk about a few other things as well, because we're all very opinionated people. So one is Jack Bilello and Linda Frank, who you all know. She is the author of children's mystery stories. And Jack, I believe, is not only a hero of East New York, but has written 4 books.
One of which is an East New York story, growing up, coming of age in East New York in the 1950s. Yes.
The title of which is?
Still love Joni James.
You know who she is? If you do, you're old. So, and by the way, he's also a paisano. I always like to add that when I introduce somebody who's a paisano. So let me just ask you a little bit about, let's start with the writing. What made you decide that you wanted to write?
Well, I always did write. I mean, when I went to Brooklyn Technical High School, I played baseball, which was my primary sport, but I also was on the school newspaper and enjoyed that process of writing, doing research, doing interviews, and so on, even to at a minor level of interviewing students and businessmen in the community. And I also then, in college, also wrote...
What college?
CCNY. From Brooklyn Tech, I went right to public school and public college. And
so did Arthur Miller, so don't worry. I think he went to Brooklyn.
Right. I believe you're right. Right. And so did Bernie. Bernie. And when Bernie was there, when I was there, only I was about a year or two older than Bernie, but we were both students at Brooklyn College at the same time.
So did you ever run into him and say, hey, you're going to run for president someday?
And so I did write. But I had, when I was teaching and I became chairman of the history department at Lindenhurst Junior and Senior High, now of course the middle school and senior high, and I did that, but I always wrote. I wrote some reviews for the History Teacher magazine and journals and so on, but I had this story in me based on a personal experience, and I knew it had to come out. So before I retired, I started the writing of a book which I thought, you know, when you tell a story, Phyllis, that story will be remembered because you've told that story and other people now will not forget it. And it also tells you a little bit about the kind of people we are and the kind of country we are when you have a good story to tell. So I thought that the story that I wrote for the first novel, called Bonds of War, was something that I wanted to pay tribute to really a heroic figure in World War II. And when he died, I said, I'm not going to let him die. I'm going to put his story in a book. And that became the basis and the heart and soul of my first novel, called Bonds of War, which is a World War II Vietnam work of historical fiction. Yeah.
That's interesting that you say that, because I have been involved in the last, I would say, 5 years of writing a memoir of my sister, who was a very famous movie star, you know, and it's called And Here's to You, Mrs. Robinson, is the title. And I can tell you that the reason I'm doing it is to keep her alive.
Okay, there you
Absolutely. Go. When I see that on a movie comes on of hers on Turner Classic Movies, and it says somebody else is starring in it and doesn't mention her, I want to scream blue bloody murder. So I'm hoping that I will eventually present something to the world to keep her alive.
I think there's a real need and market for it. Yeah.
And Linda, what started you in the writing?
Well, I have a career similar to Jack's in that I taught science for many years, and
We do it. We're all teachers.
yes, yeah. Well, it's kind of a natural outgrowth. I never really liked to write until I became a teacher, and when you teach, you write lesson plans, and you write curriculum, and you write little articles, and this, that, and the other thing. And I loved mysteries.
And report cards.
Well, that I don't consider that writing, because that was computer. But finally, I got to teach something I really loved, which was forensic science. And when I was a kid, I loved Nancy Drew. So what I did for my students was, instead of teaching them textbook notes, chalk and talk and all that, I would write them a story. And the story was a mystery, and they had to solve the mystery by using the textbook to find out the answers and then create a court case. So I liked some of the stories, and I said to myself, you know, because whenever I go on vacation, I get a Nancy Drew book and I'll read it. And I said, I bet I could do better than this, because I had the science background. And because I had that, and I love to tell stories. I would tell stories to my students all the time. They were never true. After I was all done with them and had screwed with their heads, I said, no, that's not true. But I like to tell a story. So I don't really think of it as writing as so much as telling a story. So that's what got me started. And I wrote the 2 books because I didn't know anything about writing books. I took a course, and the teacher I had said, you know, these are good, you could sell them, but it took me 7 years to sell my first book. And I thought, 7 years, I don't want to wait that long. I put them aside for 14 years. And, and what became a more viable way of publishing your books was self-publishing. And by that time, I was in my 60s. I said, I'm not going to wait to be discovered. I'll self-publish. So that's what I did. And that's how I got to where I am with a TV show and a lecture series and all kinds of school visits that we do. And
So you found that self-publishing worked for you.
oh, it did. And it works for, I mean, I have my show on this station, The Writer's Dream, and many of
Yes.
the authors that I have
Watched
are
it many
self-published.
times. And so, but what about the editing process?
Well, you have to hire an editor. You really do have to have an editor. And what I did was, I mean, you could go on the internet and you can, you know, you can Google local Long Island editors, but living where you live, there are a lot of talented writers, people. All you have to do is pretty much look at the phone book. I could give you an editor. She lives in East Hampton, and she's written a number of books, and she teaches writing. So, and she's been on my show.
Oh,
So-
great. I think I know who you're talking about.
Eileen Opser.
Yes,
Yeah,
she's my
you've-
teacher too.
There you go. There you go. There you go. So, and she's a very good editor.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah, but you have to have an editor because you're in love with your own words. There's no way you're going to kill any of those words, right?
You know, I'm not quite like that. I find that when I write something, I even when I do 2 or 3 paragraphs, I go over it again and I change and, you know, and I don't like that. This again. And God
Well, I think we
forbid
all
you
do that, but that eventual, what we think is a finished product, is not a finished product.
Yeah.
You'd be surprised.
There's that old adage, good writing is rewriting.
Yes.
And you've got to look, you know, I remember great stories about George Bernard Shaw when he, writing a letter to his friend, said, please excuse this very, very long letter. I did not have time to write a short one.
But you know what? I know exactly what he's talking about. He's talking about short writing would have been a lot more concentrated effort. It's much better, much easier to just let the words flow.
Yeah,
Wait till
exactly.
you get to a publisher and they want you to write your biography in 250 words. Speaking about concise writing.
Haha. Well, that'll be interesting.
And anytime you put yourself on a website, 250 words, 500 words, it's very, I mean, 250 words is 1 page double spaced. It's very hard to do that.
I find one of the toughest things, again, William Butler Yeats said, you've got to learn to kill your darlings. Learn to kill your darlings. Sometimes you've written something that you think is flowery and beautiful and poetic. If it doesn't advance the story, if it doesn't really pinpoint and advance that story, get rid of it. And it's tough to do because you get involved in love with your own narrative.
You know, I have a little bit of background in that kind of thing because my brother-in-law, Mel Brooks,
Oh, yeah.
is a writer, has always said, you know, it's all about the exposition of the story. And that's what you have to keep in mind as you're writing things is, does it tell the story?
Yeah.
If it doesn't tell the
Because
story.
your mind wants to take you to some personal experience you had and you want to somehow include it in the book, and it really does have to advance. Even the characters have to advance the story.
So
That's what they're there for.
yes, no, that's what you're right, the characters do have to advance the story. So did you have a lot of research to do on the thing?
Absolutely. Oh, sure. Well, as a teacher of history, and my specialty was World War II and the Civil War, American history, I was the research was not a chore. because I was so interested in the subject. But it was involving quite a bit of research, which I continue to do to this day, because I do also, like Linda, a lot of public speaking at libraries, at colleges, and so on. So this is an important part of my, my retirement years. And I was just saying to Linda, I don't think I've gotten up once in any given morning and say, I wonder what I'm going to do today. Because between the writing and the programs, and also I must admit, I'm a fanatic pickleball player. That's a new game that has caught on. So I try to get as much exercise as I can too. Yeah.
I mean, it is a physical game, not one on the computer?
No, it's a physical game. Yeah.
Oh, good, good, good. Well, keeping in shape is extremely important, especially if you've got longevity in your family, which I certainly do. So you have to keep yourself in good shape. And so then how did you get published?
Well, that in itself is even more interesting, I think, than my first book, because I had written my first novel, the manuscript at least, and I couldn't get it published. I sent it out, and I have a room full of rejections. I could place on my wall with them. But I went to see a movie at the Huntington Arts Cinema, Christ in Concrete.
Oh, I know the movie.
Okay, and Pietro di Donato, who wrote Christ in Concrete in 1939, was there speaking after the movie. The book was it's a masterpiece. It won the National Book Award, beating out John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath.
Are you kidding?
No, I'm not kidding. In
Grapes of Wrath?
1939, beat out
Good
John
God.
Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. And so Pietro was speaking after the movie, and it was fascinating. He was born in 1911. In 1927, after the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti,
I know that. I did a paper on that in college.
Okay, he became a communist because he was so disillusioned by the injustice of what happened to these two Italian immigrants.
Yeah.
And then he worked in the construction industry. His father was a construction worker, and his father fell off a building and plunged right into the wet cement, and they left him there. He's buried in the wet cement.
Because they can't retrieve the body.
Yeah, they can't retrieve the body.
There's
so
no way.
he then,
and the person will be dead anyway.
that became the heart and soul of Christ in Concrete. So he was a magnificent, he wrote about 3 books, and they were all beautiful books. A Circle of Light about Mother Cabrini was another masterpiece. So I met him after the program. He was talking, I went up to him, we were speaking. I told him I was an erstwhile writer, and he took a kind of a liking to me, and he recommended his retired editor and his retired, Bertha Klausner, her name was. She was 93 years old at that time. And her father was the campaign manager for Eugene V. Debs in the 1912 election. So that alone was a fascinating story.
If you guys don't know who Eugene Debs was, he was a leading populist.
Yeah, he was a socialist
and
who ran for
and a
president.
socialist who ran for and organized a whole party.
Yes,
You know.
yes, he was fascinating. And so I thought that in itself was a fascinating story. So Pietro said, well, I want you to call my, Bertha Klausner. And I did call her, and she says, well, send me 2 or 3 chapters. So I did, and she said, I like it, send me the whole book. And she said, look, I'm 93 years old. There are some things here that have to be worked on, but I think it's worthy of publication. She recommended a publisher in Cleveland, Ohio, small publisher, 4 or 5, person operation. And I placed it with them, and they published the book. They published my second book, but this 3rd and 4th book was self-published because I felt exploited by that small publisher. She was making the lion's share of the money, and I was getting like $1.70 for every book, and she was getting maybe $12, $13 for every book. So, I didn't.
Well, the
appreciate
whole industry has changed
Yes.
drastically.
Drastically.
Yeah, since the advent of the internet. I mean, it's
And
really
also,
amazing.
2 things that are in the favor of self-publishing is, number one, you have complete control over how your book comes out. And second of all is they pretty much try to adhere to industry standards. So it's not like Vanity Press. They won't publish anything. They'll give you a nice product. I think I'm proud of the way my books look, and they're all self-published. And I use some of their editorial services, which are very expensive. That's the problem with self-publishing but I think of it as my cupcake business. If I wanted to have a cupcake business, I'd have to go to the bank and get a loan because I'd have to rent a building, buy the equipment, materials, somebody to bake the cupcakes. I wouldn't be baking the cupcakes. And somebody to sell them, right? So you need a business loan.
I don't
So
even eat
I think of this
cupcakes.
as a business, and I'm making an investment in my books, and there they are. And someday, who knows, maybe somebody will say, these books would really make great movies for kids. So who knows?
Well, there's always that aspect, isn't
Yeah,
it?
sure. Every author would like their books made into movies, sure.
Aha.
That's all they ever talk
Well,
about.
sometimes it doesn't. It can backfire a little bit on you.
Sure.
My nephew Max Brooks wrote a book called World War Z, and it was bought, and when it was bought by a film industry, movie industry, they bought it. They made the movie. It had nothing to do with his book.
But
They just really used his title.
But see, that's the problem is if you can sell your book, you can sell the movie rights to your book.
That's right.
You need a lawyer because how you sell the book and what they do with it are, once they own the movie rights, they can make anything out of your book. You sort of have to have a lawyer to say, well, there's only so much you can change, or however that works. But once your book becomes successful, you really need a lawyer. Because everybody
Well, I
is
always
willing
wanted to be a lawyer.
That's exactly.
But yes, well, look, I mean, we all know you need a lawyer all the time, don't you?
Unfortunately.
So, from your writing and your research, both of you, what are you involved in these days?
Well, right now, I've just completed a book review for Family Magazine, and apparently they have a subscription of 500,000.
Oh, yeah, Family
so
Magazine. It's the
Family-
one they sell in the supermarket.
Yeah.
Yes, I know it.
And I just completed, I was asked to do this book review, and it's, it just was completed, so that is and then I have an idea about a story that I think is really good, but I don't know if it's enough for a novel. It may be a short story or a magazine article. It's about an Italian immigrant who came to this country in the 1870s. His name was Giovanni Martini, and he was an excellent horseman. So he went out west and joined the cavalry, and he was assigned to George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry. And then June 25th of 1876, Custer had received orders to round up what he thought were 300 hostiles. So he comes to the Little Bighorn in Montana, and Giovanni Martini didn't speak any English. So Custer wrote a handwritten note to go to his flank to give this message to Major Reno and Benteen, the two flank protectors. Just protect me. I'm going in and round up these 300 Indians. There should not be any problem. So Custer goes into the Little Bighorn. There were not 300 Indians. There were 3,000. And they were all the great chiefs assembled there. There was Yellow Hand, Red Cloud, Crazy Horse. Now, most people remember the name Crazy Horse.
Yes.
But very few know that he had a brother, Reasonable Horse. No, I'm only kidding. That has to be. See, that's what we talk about editing.
I thought that's why.
That's what we talk about.
Well, it's a
That's
good
why it
laugh.
was going to be a
Good
short
laugh
story.
line.
That's what has to be edited. That's what we're talking about editing. And Custer, of course, is wiped out to the last man. But Martini survives because he was on the flanks. There's action on the flanks, casualties, but he survives. And he finishes out his enlistment, and he moves east. He settles in Brooklyn, New York, in East New York, Brooklyn. He lives until 1929. He dies at the age of 84, and he has a wife and children and grandchildren, and he's buried at he was buried at the Bushwick Cemetery in Brooklyn. Now, the note that Custer wrote survived. It is now in the museum library at West Point. And that's how I made the connection. I worked at the Bushwick Cemetery when I was 15, just cleaning up and tidying up. And I came across this gravestone of Giovanni Martini. Didn't mean anything.